Well, a very, very warm word of welcome to you as you join me on this 5-week journey, which we have called Living in the Cycle of Grace. And on this journey, I want to share with you a real treasure. It's a treasure that has been a great, great gift to me. And I'm hoping that as we journey together, it's also going to become a very, very special gift for you. And the name of this treasure is the Cycle of Grace. It was in the mid-70s when I was studying at a university here in South Africa called Rhodes University that I was introduced to the work of a brilliant British psychiatrist by the name of Frank Lake. Dr. Frank Lake was one of the very first people who sought to integrate theological and psychological insights. And in his own work, he developed a model for human development, which he called the dynamic cycle. And then in the early 90s, I had the wonderful opportunity of spending a week with a British Anglican priest, the Reverend Anne Long. She was the founder of a movement called Christian Listeners. She had worked personally with Frank Lake and had taken what Frank Lake had developed, the dynamic cycle, and she had developed what she began to call the dynamic cycle of grace. And I can still remember when she first shared it with a group of us, how it just spoke very, very deeply to me. And over the years, it has been a great joy of mine to be able to share this treasure with others. And I'm hoping that as I share it with you on this particular journey, that it's really going to become also a treasure in your own life. Before we go any further, I know that you're meeting together for the first time as a group. And so I just thought that maybe we could pause for a moment. You could perhaps take some time to introduce yourselves to one another and what has brought you perhaps onto this particular journey. But the question that I'd like to offer to you as a group, as a kind of icebreaker, perhaps you could share with each other your response to this question. How would you describe the weather in your life right now? How would you describe? You don't need to explain what it means. Just how would you describe the weather in your life right now? I hope that as a group, you'll have a great time of conversation and connecting with each other. Be back with you soon. In my input today, which I've called Living the Right Way Round, I would like to do two things. On the one hand, I would like to share very briefly with you how the cycle of grace was developed. In the next 4 weeks, I will be unpacking it at much greater depth But what I want to do in this particular session is just share with you just how it kind of emerged in Frank Lake's thinking. And then on the other hand, I would like to describe for you the cycle of grace itself, kind of give you a kind of a wide angle view, and then, as I said earlier, over the next few weeks, delve much more deeply into it. There's going to be a diagram that will come up as I speak, and as I describe for you the cycle of grace, I really hope that that it will begin to find a way into your own heart and mind. But first, let me tell you just how it developed. Frank Lake, as I said, was a psychiatrist, and he worked very, very closely with missionaries in India, missionaries who had gone under the banner of the London Missionary Society. And he was really struck by the fact that many missionaries, even though they had started their work with a lot of energy and excitement and enthusiasm, very often they kind of burnt out, became discouraged, sometimes even cynical about the work that they were doing. And obviously, Frank Lake, in his interactions with them, was really concerned about this and wondered why this seemed to happen again and again and again. And then evidently, and this is what I learned from Anne Long, Frank Lake's path crossed with the path of a Swiss theologian by the name of Emil Brunner. And so this, on the one hand, the psychiatrist, on the other hand, this theologian came together, and they shared with each other their concern about what was happening, as it were, in the mission field. And so they made a decision that together they would take some time to reflect upon the life of Jesus in the Gospels and seek to learn from the life of Jesus, what was the secret of Jesus' life? How come Jesus, even though there were times when he would get very tired, very weary, faced a lot of opposition, you never have a sense, as you read the Gospels, you never have a sense of kind of Jesus burning out, or becoming discouraged, or becoming cynical. And so they had this conviction that if they could really reflect upon his life, they would discover, as it were, what it was that really nourished him throughout his gospel life. And it was really out of that reflection upon Jesus in the Gospels that Frank Lake first forged this model, which he called the dynamic cycle, and then which Anne Long called the dynamic cycle of grace. So let me describe it for you, and I would like you with me just to notice a few things in this kind of quick introduction to it. I want you to notice, first of all, that the cycle of grace, can you see this, is divided into two parts. That in the life of Jesus, there was input and output. That Jesus not only gave out to others, but he also received. That Jesus didn't only, as it were, constantly engage himself in ministry, but he had moments when he wasn't ministering, moments when he withdrew from ministry. There was this kind of harmony of input and output. And we get a beautiful description of this in the Gospels itself. There's a passage in Mark chapter 1, verses 29 to 39. You could almost name this passage 24 hours in the life of Jesus. So what I'm going to do is I just want to read these verses to you. And as I read these verses, now notice this dynamic cycle of grace. Not only is Jesus giving grace to others, ministering grace to others, but Jesus himself is also receiving grace. There is this sacred balance of input and output. So let me read it to you. As soon as they left the synagogue, now Jesus was at worship there in the synagogue. That was a moment, I'm sure, for Jesus of deep receiving as he worshipped God with others. And as soon as they left the synagogue, then they entered the house of Simon and Andrew and James and John. Now he's going, you can see this, he's moving now towards others. He's going into a time of ministry. Now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. He came and he took her by the hand and he lifted her up. And then the fever left her and she began to serve them. Now that's a moment of ministry. There you can see the grace of God, as it were, the healing grace of God flowing through Jesus into the life of this woman. But notice that evening at sundown, they brought to him, and you really need to imagine this, they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons, and the whole city was gathered around the door. And he cured many who were sick with various diseases, and he cast out many demons, and he would not permit the demons to speak, because they knew him. Now, again, we need to pause there. Can you just imagine the extreme output of energy that night of ministry, as Jesus is confronted with those who are ill and sick and oppressed by evil? This profound time of ministry, as the grace of God flowed through Jesus towards others. Now watch what happens. In the morning, while it was still very dark, he got up and he went away to a deserted place. And there he prayed. Now, can you notice? Here is Jesus now, disengaging, as it were, from active ministry. Here is Jesus entering into a place of receiving grace from God. He goes up. He finds a place of solitude and silence, a deserted place, and there he prays. And there his communion with Abba Father is deepened and nourished and nurtured. Now let's continue. I like this part. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. And when they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is searching for you." And he answered, "Let us go on now to the neighboring towns, so that I can proclaim the message there also. For that is what I came to do." And he went throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons. And there again you have the flow again, as Jesus moves from a time of receiving to a time of giving, and a time of sharing with others. So that's the first thing I want you and I want us to notice in this dynamic cycle of grace, is that we have this harmony, this sacred balance of input and of output when it comes to the grace of God. Now I want you to notice, secondly, that the cycle of grace begins with Jesus' receiving of unconditional acceptance. You know, Jesus, before he entered into ministry, before he gave himself to others, Jesus knew who he was. Jesus knew that he was the accepted, loved, cherished son of Abba Father. And you can imagine how that deep inner knowing that was in his life was an avenue for Jesus, for him, of just receiving into his own life the grace of God. Now, there are two wonderful moments, and you will know this, I'm sure. There are two wonderful moments in Jesus' life where you have the sense of Jesus receiving this grace of unconditional acceptance by the Father. There is that baptism moment, you remember, right at the beginning of his ministry. He goes down to the River Jordan, and there is John the Baptizer there. I always call him John the Baptizer and not John the Baptist, because if I say John the Baptist, then the Baptists think they own him. Because can you imagine me saying, John the Methodist or John the Anglican? So I call him John the Baptizer. So Jesus goes down to the River Jordan, and it's a very moving scene, as all these folk are coming into the river to be baptized by John the Baptizer. And they're doing that as an outward sign of their turning to God. And Jesus identifies himself with all these, as it were, recovering sinners, and he himself goes into the water. I find that very moving. And in that moment of baptism, he hears that voice. Do you remember? Spirit descends upon him, and he hears a voice from heaven saying, do you remember? You are my beloved, in whom I delight. And in that moment, you can almost imagine the profound sense of Jesus knowing the unconditional acceptance of Abba Father in his own life. There's another moment, you remember, just as he begins to go down to Jerusalem to give his life away on the cross in ministry for others. He has that moment on the Mount of Transfiguration. You may remember where he goes up the mountain with his three close friends. And there again, he hears the same voice that he heard at his baptism. And again, that renewal in his life of this deep, deep sense of unconditional acceptance. Jesus knows his the beloved. And that profound sense of identity precedes, it goes before his time of ministry. So I want you to notice that. But let's go back to the diagram. And now we're still looking at the input of grace into his life. It comes through this unconditional acceptance. But notice next that in the cycle of grace, Jesus received constant sustenance. We're going to look a lot at this later. But if you follow Jesus through the Gospels, he's not always giving himself to others. He has moments when he receives grace into his life in a whole lot of different ways. He goes into the silence and the solitude to be with Abba Father. That was a time of receiving grace. He spends many moments in deep prayer. Those were moments of sustenance. He goes to the synagogue for worship. He hangs out with friends. He enjoys parties. He celebrates life. He goes for long walks. He allows other people to minister to him. I can go on and on and on, and we're going to really delve very deeply into that in our third week together. But all I want you to notice now is how Jesus, throughout his ministry life, he received constant sustenance from Abba Father, which sustained him for his ministry and for his self-giving of himself to others. So in the input part of the diagram, will you notice that grace flows into his life in two ways? Unconditional acceptance, constant sustenance. Now we move to the output side of the diagram, where Jesus now, still living in the cycle of grace, now begins to, as it were, offer and to give and to minister the grace of God to others. And I want you to notice the two ways in which this happened. So notice now, fourthly, that in the cycle of grace, Jesus lived with a profound sense of significance. Now again, we will explore this further, but let me just say now that Jesus ministered to others not only through what he did. Jesus ministered to others through who he was, through his own profound sense of personal significance. Just for a moment, think of all those I am sayings in his life. Tremendous sense of significance Jesus had. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the living water. Can you sense even now the profound sense of significance with which Jesus lived and ministered to others? Jesus lived the truth of his uniqueness. Can I say it again? Jesus lived the truth of his own uniqueness. He lived with a profound sense of significance. And it was an incredible ministry to those around about him. And then let's move on to the other way in which grace flowed outwards from Jesus into the world. Notice lastly that in the cycle of grace, Jesus' life also flowed out with remarkable fruitfulness. Now, the word fruitfulness in the diagram is a word that I have brought to the diagram. That word initially was not used by Frank Lake when he first came up with the dynamic cycle. And when Anne Long introduced the model to me, she spoke here of achievement in obedient ministry. My preference, rather than the word achievement, is the word fruitfulness. That there was in Jesus' life remarkable fruitfulness. That there was achievement, if you want to put it that way, in obedient ministry. Through his preaching, his teaching, his healing, his work of deliverance, the way he formed a team together. He fed hungry people. And I can just go on and on and on again. His life was a life of remarkable fruitfulness, through which the grace of God constantly flowed to those around about him. Now, can you just notice? Can you notice the cycle, the dynamic cycle of grace? Acceptance, sustenance, significance, fruitfulness. And Jesus lived in that cycle, constantly going around in that cycle, from acceptance into sustenance, into significance, into fruitfulness, back into acceptance, into sustenance, into significance, into fruitfulness. And so Frank Lake, Emil Brunner, they felt that they had put, as it were, their fingers on what lay at the heart of the way Jesus lived and ministered. Now, this is where the light went on for me. Remember, they were working with missionaries who were burnt out, discouraged, and cynical. And so they made the observation that so often, rather than living in the cycle of grace, we live in the cycle of works. We don't start with acceptance. We start at the other end. We start with fruitfulness or achievement, and then we go in the other direction. We feel that if we can only achieve, then we will feel significant, then that will give us some energy and some sustenance, and then hopefully someone is going to accept us. And so we spend our lives, constantly seeking to achieve, constantly seeking to find significance so that we will be accepted and loved and cherished by God and by others. And that is a recipe for extreme weariness and burnout and disillusionment in our lives. And that was the light that went on for me in the early 90s. How can I live the right way round? How can I live in the cycle of grace rather than in the cycle of works? Now, I've said too much, so I'm going to, as it were, push the pause button again. We're going to go back into some conversations in our groups, and I just have two kind of wondering questions for you that perhaps you can spend a bit of time in conversation about. First of all, just what strikes you most in the cycle of grace? So what struck you? Now remember, all models are provisional, all models are imperfect, and I'm sure that you can see some flaws in this model. It's not infallible at all, but just as I shared it with you, was there anything that really struck you today, that just touched you? You just found yourself resonating with something that I said. And then the second question is, how would you describe the cycle in which you tend to live most of the time? Which way round do you find yourself living most of the time in your own life? When you look very honestly at your own life and reflect upon the patterns of your life. Do you live in the cycle of grace? Do you live in the cycle of works? Do you live more in the cycle of grace than works? Or do you live more in the cycle of works than in the cycle of grace? So I hope you really have some good conversation. You spend time together. Remember, give each other space as you share. Be generous, both in your sharing and in your listening. And I also hope that you won't try to fix each other up as you spend time sharing your hearts and minds with one another. God bless you in your conversation. Well, I hope you had a great time in conversation with each other. I really wish that I could have been as it were, fly on the wall, listening in to what struck you most in that diagram, and also perhaps even more importantly, as you reflect on the patterns of your own living, where do you locate yourself, as it were? What kind of cycle do you find yourself living in most of the time? Now, each week, I'm also going to give you, not homework, I'm going to give you some God work. And this is just like a very simple practice for the week. And I hope that when we meet together next week, we can share our experiences around the God work, which is part of our journey. And the God work and this is an invitation, is as you go through this week, perhaps at the end of each day, you can take just about 5-10 minutes and maybe just reflect on how, as you live through the week, how does grace come to you? How do you receive grace on a daily basis into your life? And you may just like to make very simple notes on your personal ways of receiving grace. Could be taking the dogs for a walk. Could be that early morning cup of coffee. Could be having supper maybe with a loved one. I don't know. Could be some moments of silence. Just make a few notes of how you personally, on a daily basis, receive grace from God into your life. And we will share that with one another when we come together next week. So have a great week, and I look forward again to being with you. God bless you.